Russell, when it comes to the discussion about, our parents had it all and they've really messed things up for the millennials, the one area that's constantly focused on is property and the fact that so many people now struggle to get on the housing ladder. Is there a generational divide that we need to address, and how should we address it?
I think that the reality is that, yes, of course, older people own vast majority of equity actually in housing. In fact, 46% of housing equity is owned by over 65. So that's a huge proportion of all housing equity, about £1.7 trillion. But of course, the argument, in my view, surely has to be that those that are now older have worked for it. They've not only worked hard and toiled and put money away, but they've also been taxed, and not just taxed from an income perspective and from a national insurance perspective, but of course they've also been taxed on goodness knows what else where property is concerned, not least the spectre, dare I say, of stamp duty, which of course after the stamp duty holiday now, Alex, has returned to normal. So, let's not forget, when you talk about the fact that, yes, lots of elderly people own properties that are more valuable because they've owned them for a longer time and because they've worked for them, that the stamp duty to buy an expensive property, so let's say something over £1.5 million, the Exchequer receives up to 17% stamp duty levy on that purchase. So I think undoubtedly, yes, whilst it could be seen as an imbalance, it's simply the fact that those that are older have worked, have accumulated, and have paid into the system. And frankly, I don't see why the elderly should have to pay twice for social care when they've spent their entire 45 to 50-year career paying into a system to fund exactly that.
What's behind the fact that young people are really struggling to get on the housing ladder? Is it as simple as the fact that, after the financial crisis, previously there were mortgages offered with 0% and, no need to pay a deposit, 5% at the max, and it's actually that's creating the problem?
I'm not sure that young people are struggling, honestly. So when you look at the proportion of purchases now that are from first-time buyers, it's about 30% of all purchases are those by first-time buyers. And that's one of the highest levels that we've seen for decades. And a lot of that, of course, is because, as you rightly referenced in your monologue at the beginning, the Bank of Mum and Dad. Now, the Bank of Mum and Dad, of course, the trickle down from all that wealth we're talking about in older people's homes, if the Bank of Mum and Dad actually were an actual bank, it would be one of the top 10 lenders in the country. In other words, if it were a bank, it literally would be one of the top 10 banks in the UK. So look, it's not so hard, particularly when you look at the level of interest rates and the fact that a mortgage for a first-time buyer in terms of the repayment is the lowest it has ever been. Arguably about to increase, of course, because we're about to see rate increases that obviously will affect the mortgage market. And of course, there's been a whole plethora of support from the government. The government very, very keen to turn everybody into a homeowner because homeowners are more likely to vote Conservative, apparently. So hence we've seen Help to Buy. We've now got the Boris mortgage, which means that as a buyer, first-time buyer under most circumstances, you only need a 5% deposit. So I'm not sure it is true that it's difficult for the youngsters of today to get on the first rung of the housing ladder. It doesn't seem that the data supports that contention, frankly.
Russell, thank you so much. And thank you for the little statistic there. The Bank of Mum and Dad, one of the top, or in the top 10 lenders in the country. Fascinating. Really interesting to have you on. I'm joined now by the educational consultant and former head teacher, Adam Peter Lang. Adam, do you think this generation of youngsters will be left with a huge educational deficit if we don't pay more attention to and invest more money in their education post-COVID?
Well, I agree with you. I'm slightly at variance with your two previous speakers, actually, because I'm a member of the Silver Generation and I think we've had it good. And that's not to say that we shouldn't be ignored, but I do think we need to focus, coming out of the pandemic, on the young people. They've had a terrible time in their education at primary level, secondary level, college level, all those vocational courses, and at university. We need to support them moving forward. And I think at one point, when the furlough scheme was introduced, the highest proportion of people on the furlough scheme were the 18 to 26-year-olds, because a lot of young people going into the pandemic had hospitality jobs, jobs in other areas which weren't necessarily well paid. So I think we owe it to that generation to look after them coming out of the pandemic. So I think there isn't a generational divide as such, but I think we ought to be very careful that we don't forget about them. There wasn't much about young people in the budget recently, and I mean we're talking today, aren't we, of the conference in Glasgow, and look at the voice of young people there in a positive way, in a very positive way, about the concerns they have for the future. So I think we need to prioritise young people more than we are doing at the moment.
And how should we begin that process? I mean, there's an argument that actually today far more young people are going to university than their parents, except the difference may be that they are ending up with masses of debt, where those who were privileged enough to go to university, 30, 40 years ago often didn't have to pay.
Well, no, that's a very good point. I mean, actually, I think in 2012 there was a peak in the birth rate in this country, and we're seeing that play through with young people. And I think I read a figure somewhere, the number of 16 to 18-year-olds is going to increase by about 15% at the moment. So, yes, you're right. I think it's 40% increase in applications to universities at the moment. And you could argue that's a good thing. You might argue that people are doing that because they don't know what the future looks like. But yes, we need to think carefully about that. But yeah, young people are coming out saddled with enormous debt from that. And that's another issue that I think we need to come back and consider.
Year on year, we see exam results being inflated, so people say, or at least improving. But do you think there is a difference in standard of education between the sort of education young people are having today, let's say especially around the 3 Rs, to that which perhaps their parents received?
Well, education changes. It's changed all around the world and it continues to change. And there are certain intrinsic sort of bedrock of it and other things that need to move on. I think that it's very difficult to look at standards over the last couple of years with the pandemic. I mean, you think of the amount of time that a 16-year-old or an 18-year-old has missed from school and even from university. And by the way, I've gone back part-time to study at university, so I'm seeing it from the other side after all these years doing with my other work. And the university students have had a terrible time in terms of provision during the pandemic. So I think we need to come out of this. We need to sort of shake ourselves down. But I do think we need to, as I said earlier, prioritise the young. Was it Kevin Collins? He was the czar for raising achievement. He wanted £15 billion put to education, and he left because he wasn't given that. And I think he commented last week on the budget saying that still wasn't enough to play catch up and to rectify these terrible problems that have happened. Young people are very resilient. What was it? Youth is wasted on the young. We had a quote from Esther earlier on. I think Oscar Wilde said that. I don't totally agree with that, but I think that we owe it to our younger generations to prioritise them more. And I think parents, grandparents actually would agree with that too.
Welcome to the GB News YouTube channel. You can watch us live 24 hours a day, catch up on your favourite shows and join in the conversation in the comments below.
Don't forget to subscribe and you'll never miss any of our exclusive content.